So by now, we've seen the happy-go-lucky times of the 1920s completely evaporate and emerge into what we call the Great Depression. What we need to talk about in this respect is what the government is doing about this economic disaster, and more importantly, the ramifications of this reaction. And so I want to start with the guy that's in the White House at the time that the economy crashes, a guy named Herbert Hoover. Now, that name might sound familiar to you because we have talked about him in this class before. He was head of the Food Administration during World War I. He was the food will win the war guy. So we're talking about a pretty accomplished politician before he had run for president. He had been in presidential cabinets as an advisor before he had run for president in 1928. Now, in 1928, Herbert Hoover won by a landslide. Remember me talking about his landslide victory over Al Smith? Well, Herbert Hoover was seen as a man that was very well qualified for the job. In a lot of ways, he really does represent the 19th century American dream. He was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was an orphan from Iowa, worked very, very hard, eventually won a scholarship to study engineering out at Stanford. And, as a very young man, he was a self-made millionaire. And so this is a real feel-good, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, old Americana story, okay? Hoover's problem, and I really do mean problem, is that he's a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he's also a prisoner of his own political philosophy, his political orientation. Okay, so let me start out with the first, the first problem he's got. Had Hoover ran in 1920 or 1924, had you never heard the names of Harding or Coolidge, there's a very good chance that Hoover would have gone down in history as a successful politician. Unlike either Harding or Coolidge, Hoover had a much more hands-on philosophy when it comes to the American government. He knew that it might make you feel good to say, look, I'm not going to touch the American economy. But the simple fact of the matter is there are certain things that the market needs the government to do if the market's going to function properly. Hoover understood this, okay? Coolidge and Harding, maybe they understood it, maybe they didn't. The fact of the matter is, they really didn't do a whole lot to address the needs of the American economy at the time. And the guy that ultimately pays the price for it is Herbert Hoover. So, had he been elected in 1924 and just kind of gone down the road of Coolidge and said, I'm not going to run for re-election, he very well might have gone down in American history as a successful president, because as you know, that was a very prosperous time in the American economy. Hoover's other problem is, although he's not necessarily as laissez-faire as somebody like Coolidge was, he's laissez-faire enough to really think that if you provide the American people with direct handouts, direct assistance, you'll poison what made America great. Hoover felt that what made America great was individualism, the word that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. The idea that every person has to go out there and make it on their own. The idea that you don't have a government, an overstepping government that's micromanaging every aspect of American life. Hoover believes that that's where the great American inventions have come from, the great American working spirit, that's where that came from. Individualism, as far as Hoover is concerned, is what made America great. And even in the depths of the Great Depression, to provide the American people with direct government assistance would be to poison, to destroy what made America great. Now, Hoover's not an idiot. He understands that this is a collective problem, and no one company, no one industry, no one state, no one region is going to fix it on its own. He understands that in order for the economy to recover, workers and farmers and employers and all these people are going to have to get together, and they're going to have to voluntarily make sacrifices. Now, again, if this sounds familiar, it should. Keep in mind, Herbert Hoover had the power as the director of the Food Administration to say, look, we're not going to eat red meat for the duration of the war. He didn't want to do that because he did not want the government forcing or telling people what they could or couldn't do. And so instead of telling people don't eat meat on Monday, he said, out of patriotism, we're asking you to voluntarily not eat meat on Monday. He takes a very similar approach to what's happening in the Great Depression. He wants workers to go ahead and voluntarily say, I would love to work 6 days a week, but to make sure that my neighbor has a job, I'm only going to work 3 days. I'm voluntarily going to not work 3 extra days so that the guy next to me doesn't get fired. He wanted Henry Ford to not produce as many cars as he had produced the previous year. Even though producing more made for more of a supply, which meant that you could attract more buyers because you're probably going to be a cheaper cost, he wanted Henry Ford to voluntarily surrender a share of the market. And so if this sounds like it's not something that the market is capable of doing, it's because it's not something that the market was capable of doing. Now, in our day and age, in the 21st century, there are people that like to revise history and rethink it, and that's all fine. But there's this idea of the Hoover alternative, in other words, the road not traveled. And Hoover being this guy that understood the dangers of big government and what would happen if you just kind of defaulted to the federal government when it comes to fixing the Great Depression, that it had to be something that the American people took the initiative to fix also. Um, as far as I'm concerned, it's very too little and very too late. Okay, and as you can imagine, Hoover's not going to get reelected in 1932. That's going to go to a guy that could arguably be said to be the most famous person in the 20th century, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt's background. He could not be any more different than Herbert Hoover if he tried. Roosevelt was literally an aristocrat. He was a wealthy landowner, or at least his family was. He had been sent to the most famous schools, the best schools that money could buy, even in high school. He attended Harvard. He was very well connected politically. I mean, after all, his last name is Roosevelt, and so he never failed to throw that name around when he entered into politics in the 1920s. The fact that his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, had once upon a time been president. So this is a guy that's not only plugged in financially, he's plugged in socially with a lot of political connections as well. Okay. Now, throughout most of the 1920s, Franklin Roosevelt is the leader in the face of the Democratic Party. But keep in mind, everybody, the only place that the Democratic Party really matters is in the South. Now, toward the end of the 1920s, Roosevelt suffered from a crippling bout with polio, a disease that attacks the nervous system, and it relegated him for much of the rest of his life to a wheelchair. So if you ever see a movie or documentary or maybe an image of Franklin Roosevelt, there's a good chance that it's going to show him in a wheelchair, even though he never allowed himself to be kind of photographed or filmed in a wheelchair when he was campaigning for president in 1932. Okay. Now, in 1928, at the same time that Hoover was elected by a landslide to the presidency, Franklin Roosevelt was elected governor of the state of New York. Now, the one thing I'd like you to understand here is from an intellectual level, an intelligence level, Franklin Roosevelt doesn't get in the same room as Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is infinitely more intelligent than Franklin Roosevelt is. Not to make the case that Roosevelt's stupid or something. I'm just saying that Franklin Roosevelt didn't see the Great Depression coming any more so than Herbert Hoover did. It blindsided him the same way that it blindsided Hoover. Now, if you're governor of the state of New York and the economy crashes, the stock market crashes, you're in a heap of trouble. Okay, and Roosevelt was in a heap of trouble in 1929 and 1930 when all of this goes down. And so, unlike Hoover, what Roosevelt comes up with is something that he calls a New Deal for the state of New York. I'm not talking about the New Deal quite yet. Roosevelt comes up with a New Deal for the state of New York where he wants to take state money, money that's coming into the State House in New York State, and use it to employ unemployed workers, people that can't find a job, people that have been laid off of their job. And even though these people aren't going to be making a lot of money, at least it's something to keep the rent going, it's something to keep the heat turned on, it's something to spend a little bit of money on groceries and keep other people employed at the same time. So whereas Hoover was very rigid and very timid to try to do new things, Roosevelt was inventive, he was innovative, he was very willing to experiment, and if it fell flat on his face, a lot of times he would admit failure and move right along. Okay? So in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt becomes a slam dunk to become the Democratic candidate for president. Now, you've got a guy that basically has no chance of winning the election. Herbert Hoover was already disliked before the bonus march, and then when that fiasco unfolded, his electability was virtually zero. Okay? So the only thing that Franklin Roosevelt said on the campaign trail in 1932 is, "I have a new deal for the American people." Well, what does a new deal mean? I mean, if you've just been thrown out of your home and you don't have a job and the prospects of you getting a job are very, very slim, you might want to know a little bit more about what Roosevelt means when he says New Deal. Well, Roosevelt purposefully kept that to himself in the campaign of 1932 because all he really needs to do is allow Hoover to self-destruct. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this is probably the low point. The depth of the Great Depression is probably that winter of 1932 into 1933. Roosevelt had been elected, and if you're on the PowerPoint slide that says the election of 1932, if you're following along with me, I know the red states are typically identified as Republican states, but in this case, the map it indicates a red state as a Democratic state. That's a very red map, okay? So anyway, Franklin Roosevelt, at least on the surface level, appeared to appreciate the severity of the crisis much more than Herbert Hoover did, and he wins a landslide of victory. And not just Roosevelt, but Democrats all across the board. Keep in mind, guys, this is the Republican Depression. A Republican was in the White House at the time that the economy crashed, and for the most part, the Republican Party was the dominant party. It was the party that controlled Congress more times than not, and Republican talking points, the political rhetoric, was generally of the Republican orientation. So Democrats are picking up seats in the Senate and the House of Representatives, in governor races, in mayoral races, all across the board. This is a sweeping victory for the Democrats. And we'll talk about the significance of 1932 as we close out this lecture. But in 1933, after Roosevelt was inaugurated, we got a good close look of what he meant when it comes to New Deal. For your notes, what the New Deal was a governmental program that was designed to restore the American economy. Okay? So in essence, it was Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to get the economy moving again, right? Get the economy back up on its feet so it could be rebuilt once again. For your notes, it's an unmistakable expansion of the government. The government is getting bigger, radically bigger. The government is becoming more and more powerful. You'll see why here in just a minute. And the government is beginning to be more and more felt in American life, which can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing depending on who you are. Now, a perfect example of what I mean by the New Deal would be the National Recovery Act. The NRA, as it came to be known, was sort of a centerpiece of the first New Deal in the sense that what it did was it made a lot of those suggestions that Herbert Hoover had wanted Americans to voluntarily do. You know, don't go ahead and undercut your neighbor by working 6 days. Don't go ahead and undercut your competition by producing more. It made those things illegal. Okay, so for your notes, what the NRA does is it kind of puts standards into the American economy enforced by the power of the federal government, right? So maximum working laws and minimum wages and other regulations that are being enforced by the federal government. Now, the symbol of the NRA and consequently the early New Deal would be the blue eagle that you should be looking at if you're looking at that slide entitled The New Deal. On the left is a poster that you would see hanging in windows or shop fronts, sort of similar to what the waitress is doing, hanging that NRA banner in the window of that restaurant. Okay. Now, of course, like anything else, there were critics of the New Deal. And the critics of the New Deal were very apt to say that all the Blue Eagle was the swastika of the New Deal. In other words, you had Adolf Hitler that was pretty much installing a dictatorship in Nazi Germany, and that symbol was the swastika. And as far as a lot of people were concerned, a lot of people in big business, a lot of the industrialists considered Franklin Roosevelt to be installing a dictatorship through his New Deal. And because the Blue Eagle was the symbol of the New Deal for all intents and purposes, they called it the swastika of the New Deal. You'll see what I'm talking about here in just a moment. Now, I don't need you to get every one of these laws that I'm about to tell you into your notes. I just need you to see the big picture. The first 100 days of the New Deal are what historians kind of refer to as alphabet soup. Other historians call this legislative diarrhea. I know that sounds kind of tacky, but I mean, it just goes, it comes from the brain of Roosevelt into the mouth of Congress, down to the stomach, and just out into the American electorate very, very quickly. So you are going to see a flurry of these new laws that are designed to restore the American economy. I only need you to be mindful of a couple of them, okay? The first one that I'd like to talk about would be the Emergency Relief Banking Bill. In 1933, what this does is it closes down the banks for a couple days. Now, I want you to understand something very important. It does not nationalize them. It does not take them over. When the banks reopened, they opened under the guidance of the federal government, under the backing of the federal government. Now, what I mean by this, and this should ring a bell if you've made a deposit recently, it reopened the banks, under the backing of the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. And if you read that print under FDIC at your bank the next time you're in there, you'll know that every dollar that you invest in that bank, every dollar that you deposit, is insured up to $250,000 by the federal government. So even if the bank fell flat in its face, you know you're going to get your money back. Now, the reason that Roosevelt passes this is quite simple. He wants people to get confidence in the banking system once again. He wants them to stop putting their money under a mattress or in a coffee can in the backyard, and he wants to put them back in the bank. And if the banks have more money, they're going to be far more likely to loan that money. So it's a way of kind of restoring confidence in the American economic system. The other thing that I should probably mention early on in the New Deal, the first 100 days, would be the Economy Act. What this did was it cut federal spending for veterans and federal employees. So for the most part, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal starts out on really conservative principles. He does not nationalize the bank. He doesn't take over private industry. He just kind of buttresses it, okay? The problem still becomes supply and demand, though, right? The banking bill might have stopped some of the runs that were being made on the banks, but it really didn't do a whole lot to get people spending again. One of the most direct ways that we can see the problem of supply and demand would be in the farming industry, okay? Now, farmers had gotten really used to those high prices that were in the economy in the war years because food was at a premium. After the war, that need really went away, and farmers were producing more and more and more. And the more that they produced, the further in the hole that they got. So the problem that the farmers had in the 1930s is they literally priced themselves out of the market. Well, how do you get supply and demand back in sync? In order to do that, you've got to not farm as much land. You can't produce as much wheat, as much corn, as much pork. In order to do that, you have to sacrifice. Well, to that end, what Roosevelt tried to do was give us the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. What this law did was it subsidized farmers. It paid them not to farm. It paid them not to farm as much. Okay? So what it's trying to do is artificially restrict the amount of supply of agricultural products that are being dumped on the American economy so that the demand will come back up. He's trying to get supply and demand back in sync with one another. He's also trying to standardize American industry through the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA. Okay? And in a lot of ways, what the NIRA is doing is it's really trying to provide some of those regulations that Hoover wanted to become kind of voluntary, right? Labor standards and whatnot. One thing that is probably worth noting, though, is there was a bullet point in the NIRA, Section 7.A, that said that industrial workers would now legally have the right to form unions if they wanted them. Now, this is really important considering this is the first president to really provide a permanent backing of that, okay? So the Civilian Works Administration, later on the Works Progress Administration, it did on a federal level what Roosevelt had been doing on a state level. It paid unemployed workers to produce public projects, roads and bridges, schools, airports, on the federal government's dime. The Public Works Administration, very similar. One of my favorite New Deal institutions, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, took all of these unemployed workers in the southeastern part of the United States, and it paid them to harness some of the natural resources that would be conducive to laying a new electrical grid. And so not only is this putting workers in the southeastern part of the United States to work, it's giving them a reason to get up in the morning, it's also giving them some money to spend. It's also producing something that's very useful for Americans to have: cheap energy, right? The TVA is one of the most successful New Deal agencies in the sense that everybody won. I mean, the unemployed worker that got a job was happy, and the person that, first of all, probably didn't even have electricity, let alone cheap electricity, that person was very happy as well. Lastly, the Federal Emergency Relief Act in 1933, it gave states and local governments money to do with as they felt necessary. So if you wanted to provide direct handouts, you could do that. If you wanted to use it the way that the government was doing for like a public works project, you could do that. In any case, you're closer to the problem, so address the problem. Now, one thing that I would like you to write down would be the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. Okay? Roosevelt understood that one of the reasons that the economy crashed is a lack of regulation, especially when you consider the financial industry, the banking industry. Okay? And so what the Glass-Steagall Act does in 1933 is it kind of puts a firewall in between investment banking and um, private banking, right? So investment bankers like J.P. Morgan can't take the deposits that you and I are depositing into our checking and our savings accounts, personal banking, can't use that money to go out there and make these risky loans. Keep in mind, buying on margin had become a problem and a contributing factor to the coming of the Great Depression. And what Glass-Steagall was hoping to do is really prevent that problem from happening again by really keeping Wall Street on a tight leash when it comes to what it could do or what it could not do. So for your notes, what I need you to understand about Glass-Steagall, I really don't need you to get to every minute detail. I just need you to understand that one of the things that it's doing is it's really reining in the power of Wall Street. It's telling Wall Street bankers, look, this is the rule when it comes to what you can loan money to and what you can't. Okay, this will be very important as we approach the 21st century. Okay, here's the problem with the New Deal, or at least the first New Deal. In 1935, as it's beginning to make its presence felt, and as the economy is beginning to maybe not recover, but at least begin a recovery, the Supreme Court declares the New Deal unconstitutional. In a decision entitled Sketchy versus the United States, The Supreme Court said that nowhere in the Constitution does it give the federal government, Franklin Roosevelt, Congress, or otherwise, the power to tell private industries, private entrepreneurs, how they can or cannot run their business. One of these industrialists were the Sketchy brothers in the Carolinas. They were chicken meat packers. They were poultry packers. And one of the things that the New Deal said was in order to sell meat, you had to meet certain criteria. It had to be a certain grade. And the Sketchy brothers resented this for obvious reasons. And they took the federal government to court. And in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, the Sketchy decision, they won. Now, the significance of the Sketchy decision is that it takes down with it everything that the New Deal had done in addition to regulating industry. It knocked down the fact that workers could form unions, and it took down various other things that kind of threw the New Dealers, Franklin Roosevelt included, back to the drawing board. Okay? So two things happen at the aftermath of this Supreme Court decision. Number one, the Supreme Court is going to become one of Franklin Roosevelt's most intense enemies for the duration of his presidency. You'll see what I'm talking about in another lecture. The second thing that we see is the emergence of the Second New Deal. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt is forced to go back to the drawing board, and what comes out of the ashes of the first 100 days is what historians call the Second New Deal. Okay? Now, what I'm talking about is largely legislation that comes out between 1935 and 1938. But what I want you to write down next to the Second New Deal is Franklin Roosevelt began to emphasize social justice in this Second New Deal. Justice, economic justice, social justice for groups of Americans that were having trouble protecting themselves, were most vulnerable to this industrial urban crisis that had been brought about through the Great Depression, but really didn't have any way of protecting themselves. Okay, so a couple quick examples. One of the things that critics of Roosevelt and the New Deal had continuously asked the president is, how do you plan on paying for any of this stuff? How do you plan on subsidizing farmers? Well, in 1935, Franklin Roosevelt got much more specific in the Revenue Act. Now, for your notes, what the Revenue Act was designed to do was tax Americans that made more than $50,000, right? Put a hefty tax on people making more than $50,000. Now, in our day and age, $50,000 seems kind of middle classish. It is, and it's good money, but it's probably not what you think of when it comes to the upper class. But take into consideration for just a minute that the average income in 1935 was $6,300. $50,000 is an awful lot of money. So even though the critics of Roosevelt called this the Soak the Rich campaign, at the same time, this is going to make Roosevelt some friends when it comes to the voting electorate of the United States. Okay? A couple more laws that I'd like you to be familiar with that, one, are part of the Second New Deal, and two, are emphasizing social justice. One would be the Wagner Act in 1935. Now, Roosevelt doesn't have a whole lot to do with the coming of the Wagner Act. It's mainly a senator from New York, a guy named Robert Wagner, that sponsors a bill that bears his name that ultimately will give industrial workers the right to form unions. And not only that, the Wagner Act says that if employees choose to have a union, employers like Henry Ford had to bargain collectively with them. In other words, they had to do what workers had been trying to get employers like Ford to do for a long time, trying to bargain as a collective group rather than simply asking for a raise, asking for time off, asking for shorter or safer working conditions on an individual basis, right? It said you had to recognize the union, and you also had to at least negotiate with the union. Maybe you don't get $5 an hour, maybe it's $4.50, but you at least had to come to the bargaining table with something, okay? Now, as you can imagine, when Roosevelt signs this law, it's going to make him wildly popular with working class America. It's going to make him wildly unpopular with business leaders throughout the United States. Okay. The last law that I'd like you to be mindful of would be the Social Security Act, which emerges in the same year, 1935. Now, the Social Security Act, I venture to guess many of you have heard of this before. The Social Security Act, for all intents and purposes, is essentially an old age pension. The problem that a lot of those people that are working in the factories of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, the problem that many of them have is they literally die on the line, right? I mean, they cannot afford to retire. The conditions are so oppressive that there comes a point in time that they just simply can't keep up with the pace of work any longer, and therefore they just kind of keel over and they die. Roosevelt wants to end this for moral purposes, and he also wants to get all these old-timers out of the economy, because he knows if he can get those old-timers to retire, what that's going to do is it's going to open up opportunities for younger people to get jobs, okay? So you're killing two birds with one stone. You're letting grandma and grandpa retire with some dignity intact, and you're also opening up job opportunities for younger generations to come in and kind of move the economy forward, okay? So it was basically money to look after yourself after you retired, but it was taken out of your income. It was not charity. It's not as if the federal government's just kind of doing this on its own. We still pay into a Social Security tax every time that you get a paycheck. The federal government takes money out to support this Social Security agency. Okay. Now, what you might not be all that familiar with is other aspects of Social Security. For instance, most of the people that are on what you and I would commonly known as welfare would be children, people through who no fault of their own cannot afford to put food on their table or roofs over their heads, right? And so people like children are benefited by this Social Security Act. People that either cannot work any longer or cannot work to begin with are benefited from them. I had a friend that was jogging. It was a very icy morning, and he was jogging, and he slipped, he fell, and long story short, he broke his neck and was paralyzed from the waist down. The guy collects a Social Security check once a month because he was a construction worker, and he can no longer kind of do that type of work any longer, right? Now, it's not very much money, but what the Social Security Act does, and I want you to write this down, is it provides a social safety net. It says, look, even if the unthinkable happens, you break your neck, you're blinded, you can't work any longer, or at least you can't work in this particular industry any longer, it does not mean a death sentence. It does not mean that your only recourse is to die and to wither out on the street, okay? It's a social safety net. Whether you're talking about allowing people to retire at a specific age, or ensuring that they don't simply die if a tragic accident happens, okay? Now, as you might imagine, this really doesn't put Roosevelt in a very flattering light with some of the richest and most powerful Americans in the country at the time, okay? And the Republican Party tries to counter in 1936. Now, the Republicans aren't exactly in a very good position to do this, considering most Americans still blame them for the Great Depression to begin with. It started on their watch. A lot of the political talking points were Republican-oriented in the first place, so a lot of people just still blame them. But if you were to look at the polls, the political polls, the predictors of the outcome of the election, just about all of them had the Republican challenger from Kansas, a guy named Alf Landon, had him blowing the doors off of Franklin Roosevelt. Okay. Once again, if you look on that slide entitled The Election of 1936, you're going to see an even redder map. And again, I know that we typically associate red states with Republican states, but this particular map, the red states are the Democratic states, and another overwhelming landslide for Franklin Roosevelt. And once again, more and more Democrats pick up seats in both houses of Congress and positions as governors and mayors. Okay. At the 1936 convention, Franklin Roosevelt gives a speech that's entitled, "I welcome their hatred." Now, I've pinned this into a couple different places in Blackboard, but one of the places that you can get it most directly is right underneath this lecture. It's just a YouTube clip, approximately 5 minutes. But take a listen when you have a chance. Take a listen to that soundbite and listen to what he has to say. He starts out the speech by saying, there has never really been in the history of American politics this unanimous, united front in terms of hatred for one political candidate as corporate America has for me. Okay? So Roosevelt knew that things like the Wagner Act, the Social Security Act, the NRA, even though it was deemed unconstitutional, the New Deal, generally speaking, was making him miserably unpopular as far as corporate America was concerned. But instead of kowtowing to this corporate anger, instead of rolling over and more or less giving corporate America what it wanted, which was free reign of the economy back, Roosevelt said, "I welcome their hatred." In other words, as he put it, these corporatists that were used to getting their way up until 1932, as he put it, they met their match in his first administration. And he said, "I would like to have it thought that in my second administration, these forces of corporate greed, corruption, and the usurpation of power would meet their maker." His terminology, not mine. In other words, what we're going to see in a second term with Franklin Roosevelt is an American government that worked not for the corporate interest like it had up until 1932. It would be a much more progressive government that would work for the mainstream of America, the little guy, the working class, the lower middle class, the middle class. It would turn attention of government back to the people that needed government attention and protection the most. And this landslide victory really does ensure that something is going to happen. I'm not going to give away what's going to happen quite yet because there's something else I want to tie up this lecture with. But we are going to see more New Deal reform on the horizon in Franklin Roosevelt's second term in office. Okay, it's going to be an extension of the second New Deal. But for our purposes right now, what I want to end with today is something called a political transition, and you really need to be mindful of this. Up until 1932, the dominant political party had been the Republicans. The only place that the Democratic Party really mattered was the South. Okay? That will change in 1932 primarily because of Herbert Hoover and especially because of the Great Depression, because most people blame the Republicans. The Democrats were given a unique opportunity to replace them, and that's exactly what happens. 1932 ushers in a political transition in which the Democrats replace the Republicans as the dominant party. The Democratic talking points, liberalism, the fact that the government should expand to protect those individuals that cannot protect themselves, the idea that government should provide security if private industry, if private interests can't do this on their own or won't do this on their own. Okay? Those are going to be the mainstream talking points. But what I want to leave you with is after 1932, we have become a liberal left of center country. Before 1932, we were a conservative right of center country. But from 1932 until at least 1968, we're going to be liberal in our political orientation. Our political talking points are really going to subscribe to the liberal variety. Most, not all, but many of your politicians, mainstream politicians, are going to be Democrats, and many of them are going to be liberal Democrats. And so the next time we come back, we're going to be talking about what a lot of historians consider to be the end of the New Deal, but we're also going to be talking about what that New Deal really did, how it made its presence felt, not in American politics, but in American social relations, how this really changed the game in terms of the growth of a vibrant American middle class, and a middle class that actually had some say in its government. So that's where we'll leave it for the time being.